It is the start of the 31st millennium. Under the leadership of the Emperor of Mankind, the Imperium's Great Crusade has been conquering and uniting humanity's lost colonies for more than 200 years. The Ulanor campaign has just come to an end. The combined forces of 100,000 Space Marines, more than 8 million troops of the Imperial Army, as well as almost 100 Titans of the Collegia Titanica, successfully defeated the largest force of orcs the Imperium had ever faced. The orc overlord Erlak Erg had been killed in hand-to-hand combat by Horus Lupercal, Primarch of the 16th Legion called the Lunar Wolves. With their leader slain, the Greenskin Empire disintegrated into smaller warbands. The splintered remnants of the orcs were ruthlessly hunted down across the Ulanor system and ultimately destroyed. After this overwhelming victory, it was believed that the orcs would never again be able to pose a serious threat to the Imperium of Mankind. And so this important battle marked a new high point for humanity's Great Crusade. Confident in their success and ready to transfer responsibilities, the Emperor raised Horus to the rank of Imperial War Master, granting him the authority to command his brother Primarchs and their Astartes legions in the Great Crusade. In light of this majestic event, the Emperor also suggested that the Lunar Wolves should be renamed to the Sons of Horus. But the ever-diplomatically minded Horus humbly refused the honor so as to not agitate his brother Primarchs. At the same time, the Emperor established the Council of Terra, entrusting Malcador the Sigillite, a powerful psyker, to lay the foundations of the Imperium's first large-scale bureaucracy that we would come to know as the Administratum. One of their first orders was the increased involvement of remembrances to document the achievements of the Great Crusade. The transfer of responsibilities freed the Emperor from his direct command duties, allowing him to return to the Imperial Palace to continue working on his secret Webway project. However, in this moment of victorious glory, the Emperor's announcement had come unexpectedly, and his decisions bewildered the assembled Primarchs. The mystery around the Emperor's sudden retirement and the blatant preferential treatment of Horus would mark this moment as the beginning of tensions between the Astartes legions. However, after the extensive victory celebrations on Ulanor had come to an end, the Great Crusade would resume and the Space Marine legions continued their conquest amongst the stars once more. The 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, under the personal command of Horus himself, had since subjugated 18 systems. By chance, their scouting elements ahead of the Expeditionary Fleet had recently discovered a new human-inhabited system comprising 9 civilized planets. The 63rd Fleet made their way towards the system, which they simply designated as 63-19, as it would soon become the 19th tally of their conquest. According to protocol, upon arrival in a new system, the fleet would make the newly discovered humans an offer to join the Imperium out of their own free volition. And so a diplomatic delegation led by the popular Lunar Wolves captain Hasta Sejanus was sent to the surface to negotiate a treaty. The planet's local leader, who surprisingly enough also called himself the Emperor of Mankind, was delighted to receive these ambassadors of the Expeditionary Fleet. However, once he was informed of their purpose to bring their small civilization into the fold, he immediately refused their proposal. In their isolation and ignorance, the small empire of 63-19 ironically considered itself to be the epitome of civilization and the true origin of humanity. In his misguided grandeur, the false emperor was in fact insulted when Sejanus refused to swear fealty to him. He ordered his elite palace guards, the so-called Invisibles, to kill the Space Marine delegation. This unprovoked hostility would of course not go unanswered. The death of his favorite captain enraged Horus and left him with no choice but to establish imperial rule by military force. A new delegation was sent to the planet in a final attempt to convince the planet to capitulate without bloodshed. But this time it was accompanied by a huge armed force to enforce the subjugation. It would be their final chance to surrender, but before any further contact could be established, the invaders were already fired upon by the planetary defenses. And so a combination of Astartes and Imperial Army forces swiftly made planetfall and ruthlessly assaulted the capital of System 63-19. Stormbirds and drop pods started landing on the surface. The invaders' firepower was overwhelming, and before long almost the entire city was in control of the Lunar Wolves. Whilst the Imperial Army units secured the city, the Space Marines made their way to the Imperial Palace to find this false Emperor. After fierce hand-to-hand combat, the Astartes completely wiped out the stealth-cloaked palace guards. While these Invisibles had been a formidable fighting force in their own right, and even managed to take the lives of a few Astartes, they ultimately proved no match for the battle-ready Lunar Wolves. Garviel Loken, captain of the 10th Company, ascended to the highest levels of the palace and was the first to reach the throne room. It was a beautiful structure made of enormous white plastered walls and glass roofs. In the throne room of the false emperor stood a massive golden throne. The impressive architecture of the royal structures would become inspiration for parts of the imperial palace back on Terra that was still under construction. And many of the splendid ornaments here would later even be moved to Holy Terra to decorate it. In the throne room he found a single old man, assumed to be the misguided emperor of the besieged world. Without his bodyguards he posed no threat. Loken tried convincing him of the ignorance of his resistance, but the false emperor would not believe that a far grander empire of humanity was already uniting amongst the stars beyond his own system, and still refused to surrender. When other Astartes arrived on the scene, he demanded an audience with the highest person of rank. Some of the Astartes suggested simply killing the ignorant old fool right there, but as a sign of respect for this soon-to-be dismantled empire, Garviel Loken chose to honor the old man's request. And so, War Master Horus himself was summoned to come to the surface of 63-19 in person. But a glimmer of refracting light on top of the golden throne betrayed a figure hidden by a cloaking device to be sitting there. Loken realized the old man wasn't really the emperor he claimed to be, but probably just a decoy. It was likely that the request for an audience with the War Master was a trap designed to kill him. He decided to end the deception and shot the impostor with his bolter, then made his way towards the large golden throne. But before he could reach it, a sudden, powerful blast wave filled the throne room. Because his ruse had been uncovered, the Invisible Emperor had no choice but to prematurely activate the throne room's defense mechanism. The golden throne he sat upon emitted an unstoppable gravimetric force, throwing all the Astartes warriors to the ground. Several of them were blasted against the walls with such a force that it crushed their bones. Others were knocked through the glass windows and fell down the high spires of the palace. But before anything else could occur, the upheaval was interrupted by a tremendous shock. With a blinding flash, someone violently teleported into the throne room in front of the golden throne. It was Horus Lupercal himself. His huge master-crafted power armor easily withstanding the throne's debilitating blast waves. Due to the close proximity of the teleportation's location, the sudden warping of reality had caused a rupture that brutally tore off the false emperor's cloaking device and revealed the previously invisible figure sitting on the throne. Horus instantly shot him, and before so much as a blink could happen, only the smoldering remnants of his charred skeleton lay there. The bones of his arms still clutched onto his destroyed throne. As the Astartes got to their feet, Garviel Loken looked up at the splendid War Master in massive bright white armor towering over him. Horus spoke.
So will I deal with all tyrants and deceivers.
He had just personally teleported into the throne room and slain the false emperor. After the assault was over and the city secured, a large number of remembrances, many of which had only recently joined the Great Crusade, were sent to the surface to record the victory. Although the Astartes were already known to be ruthlessly effective warriors, what the remembrances witnessed in the capital that day seemed particularly gruesome. Most buildings in the city were severely damaged by overwhelming amounts of explosions and shrapnel. Everywhere the torn-apart corpses of the defenders still lay scattered in the streets. Wherever the remembrances looked, they witnessed gory puddles of blood and body parts. In retaliation for the cowardly slaughter of Sejanus and his delegation, the Lunar Wolves had not bothered taking any prisoners. They had completely ravaged the defenders without any mercy. Sejanus had been part of the Lunar Wolves' Mournival, a close-knit group of high-ranking space marines that served as the personal advisors to War Master Horus. Sejanus' unfortunate murder meant a replacement had to be found. Garviel Loken had been rising through the ranks, and his recent achievement of being the first to reach the throne room had brought him to the attention of his battle brothers. And so, on a night lit by the crescent moon, Loken was summoned to a ceremonious meeting where he would meet the other members and be inducted into the Mournival. The other members were Ezekiel Abaddon, first captain of the Lunar Wolves and second in command after Horus; Horus Axamond, nicknamed Little Horus for his uncanny physical likeness to the War Master and captain of the 5th Company; and finally Tarik Togeddon, captain of the 2nd Company. After taking his vows, Loken became an official member of the Lunar Wolves' War Council and a trusted advisor to War Master Horus. This new responsibility meant he would no longer be available to lead the troops of the 10th Company into battle at all times himself, so he would have to assign someone else to substitute his command. Although battle brother Xavier Jubal had been second in command to him, Loken personally preferred his close companion Nero Vipus instead. Loken's new rank as a prestigious member of the Mournival bestowed him the authority to bypass the usual chain of command, and so following his intuition, he chose to promote Nero instead. The planet's last remnants of resistance had a last holdout in a place called the Whisperhead Mountains. It was a strong fortress on top of a high mountain that the inhospitable terrain made difficult to reach. Over the span of several weeks, units of the Imperial Army had been attempting to defeat this last bastion of resistance, but were met with little success. After some deliberation, Command considered Astartes' intervention necessary. Garviel Loken and his 10th Company were ordered to capture the Whisperhead's holdout and swiftly bring the conflict to an end. Their Stormbird transports loaded up with tactical and Terminator squads and departed towards the enemy defenses on the mountaintops. On the way there, they noticed mysterious Vox interference. It was believed that the enemy disturbed their signals by broadcasting a whispering voice, saying the following thing:
Samus, that's the only name you'll hear. Samus, it means the end and the death. Samus, I am Samus. Samus is all around you. Samus is the man beside you. Samus will gnaw upon your bones. Look out, Samus is here.
For now, they concluded that the enemy had somehow managed to hack into their Vox systems to spread their propaganda, and so they ignored the sinister voice and went on with their mission. The combat on the mountaintop turned out to be completely one-sided, as the Astartes made short work of the resistance and suffered not a single loss. Once they had achieved victory, Garviel Loken ordered his Space Marines to regroup, but one of the tactical squads had gone missing and did not respond to any Vox communications. They set out to investigate the situation, and before long, they arrived at a horrible scene. Xavier Jubal, the missing element's sergeant, had murdered all of the battle brothers in his squad. Loken told his troops to detain Jubal, but he resisted the arrest and shrugged off the other Astartes like it was nothing, killing several more Space Marines in the process. He looked demonically possessed and kept shouting, "Watch out! Samus is here!" Loken drew his combat knife and dueled the renegade Astartes. It was a hard-fought battle, but he eventually managed to kill Jubal with a stab through the chest. After the incident, the bodies of the dead Astartes were taken back to Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, for investigation. Back on the flagship, Loken summoned his close friend Kirill Sinderman to him for a debriefing. Sinderman was an old man, and one of the most prestigious iterators that accompanied the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet. The body of Jubal and the other dead Space Marines present in the room surprised Sinderman. As he had been told, there had been no losses during the assault on the Whisperhead Mountains. That much was true. The defenders had not managed a single kill, and the resistance was easily destroyed. Loken instructed him that this would continue to be the official record. No mention of a fight between Astartes brothers was allowed to spread, as it would be devastating for morale. Whatever had happened to Jubal, according to the Imperium's secular truth, demonic possession did not exist. Instead, Sinderman was told to come up with a story of a Stormbird landing accident. But privately between these two men, Sinderman suggested that it might have been a disease. Of course, Astartes were immune to almost any virulent kind of plague, but perhaps a virus had somehow corrupted Jubal's mind and caused his violent outburst. They both agreed that given the circumstances, this was the most logical explanation. But before they had finished their conversation, suddenly the corpse of Jabal opened his eyes and once again screamed about Samus. With weird, contorted motions, his corpse rose to his feet. Before they could process what had just happened, the undead Jabal started running towards them. Loken was knocked aside by the rampaging charge, and Jabal grabbed Kirill Sinderman and then lifted him off the ground. But the demonic screams had alerted Nero Vipers, who entered the room and started shooting his bolter at the undead Space Marine. Jabal threw the body of Sinderman in his direction. The old Remembrancer would have died right there if Nero had not managed to catch him and break his fall. But the rescue allowed the demon to escape the room. Jabal made his way through the hallway where he encountered the Pict Recorder, Euphrates Keeler, and several other Remembrances. He killed 2 of them in a brutal fashion, ripping their guts out, and with a wide, gaping demonic mouth, bit one of their heads straight off. Before he could kill the other Remembrancer, Loken and Nero chased it down and began shooting their bolters on full auto. It took 90 bolter rounds before the monstrosity would stop moving. Not that there was much left of the mangled corpse of Jabal, but they decided to use a flamer to incinerate his remains nonetheless, to make sure he wouldn't get up again. After the horrific event, War Master Horus came to speak with Loken. Despite being only a new member of the Mournival, he would be trusted with the truth. Horus explained to him that Jabal had been possessed by the warp. Loken was surprised, as such a concept seemed to be against the Imperial truth. But Horus explained to him that a demon like Samus is essentially nothing more than a poorly understood warp entity. The word demon was simply a non-scientific superstitious term for some kind of alien species from the warp. Although it has no physical manifestation, ultimately it was not so much different to the Eldar or the Orcs. Although the Emperor had not explained this to Horus directly, the War Master speculated that after the triumph of Ulanor, the Emperor entrusted him to lead the Great Crusade and his brother Primarch, so the Emperor would have time to study and understand the warp. He told Loken that although the warp works in mysterious ways, it isn't sorcery. Surely the Almighty Emperor would eventually find a way to bring the entities of the warp to their knees, just like everything else that had stood in the Imperium's way before. Rational mastery over the warp would soon dispel any superstitions about demons and gods. Although confusing, all of this was in accordance with the Imperial truth. What Horus did not tell Loken, however, was that he was already harboring doubts about these truths himself. His trust in the Emperor's decisions was waning. His insecurities had led the War Master to seek more advisors than just the 4 members of his Mournival. Most notably amongst his new counselors was Erebus, the first chaplain of the Word-Bearers Legion. Their Primarch Lorgar and his legion had a proclivity for the religious, although this went against the rules of the secular Imperium. They had worshipped the Emperor himself. For this disobedience, they would eventually be severely punished when the Emperor ordered Rabut Gilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, to assault the Word-Bearers' capital Monarchia and have all of its sacred sites destroyed. After this humiliating event, the Word-Bearers chose to focus their attention on other deities instead. In their search for the divine, the Word-Bearers came to develop a deeper understanding of the warp and its demonic entities than most. In order to effectively counsel the War Master on these matters, First Chaplain Erebus had been invited to personally accompany the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet. Although frowned upon, the concept of private warrior lodges where Astartes of the Great Crusade could circumvent the strict hierarchy of rank and instead speak from man to man had spread throughout many of the legions. These unofficial lodges were a way for the soldiers to fraternize and speak their minds without fear of repercussion. Garvio Loken was against these sorts of secret gatherings. He believed that the secrecy of the lodges would lead to even more secrecy and eventually to division within the Legion itself. After he had found a large membership badge on Jubal's dead body, he began to question to what extent the lodges had been taken hold within the Lunar Wolves Legion. To find out, he attended a large meeting where his second-in-command Nero Vipers was present. But after experiencing for himself the positive effects on brotherhood these private conversations could have, he somewhat softened up to the idea of the warrior lodges. The Expeditionary Fleet received a distress call from a planet that had aptly been named Murder. The Blood Angels Legion had already attempted to conquer the planet, but had run into fierce resistance against an alien force called the Mega Arachnids. These spider-like aliens had hard exoskeleton armor, able to withstand bolter-fire, and their claws were sharp enough to cut the ceramite armor plates of the Astartes. The planet's atmospheric storms disrupted travel and communications with the surface, and many Blood Angel companies had already gone missing in action. The legions of the Emperor's children and Lunar Wolves sent forces to the planet to help their Blood Angel's cousins. The Emperor's children were the first to deploy, and made planetfall with their drop pods, but due to the turbulent atmosphere, the attacking force scattered. They soon found out that the planet was a death trap with no way out. The mega-arachnids attacked in devastating waves, killing many Astartes. Just like the Blood Angels before them, the Space Marines of the Emperor's children would soon be wiped out, if it hadn't been for Captain Sol Tarvitz of the 10th Company. When the flying mega-arachnids started impaling dead Astartes on the surrounding trees, he gave the order to have these destroyed. This led him to discover the large tree-like structures on the surface were not actually part of the planet's biosphere, but instead weather control structures causing the storms. Realizing this, they quickly demolished more of them, opening a gap in the storm for more reinforcements to safely arrive and establish a defensive stronghold. Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels, personally came to the surface. Upon seeing so many of his legion massacred, he wept. He asked Horus for assistance to avenge the fallen Space Marines, and so together the three legions started a campaign to wipe out the abominable Spider Xenos. In this ruthless 6-month campaign, they were even assisted by a Titan Legio of the Mechanicum. Before they had been able to wipe out the mega-arachnids completely, they were contacted by an advanced human civilization called the Interrex, asking the Astartes to call off their war against the mega-arachnids. The Interrex appeared peaceful, and so their request was obliged for the time being. Diplomatic negotiations were taking place on their home planet Zenobia, but the Interrex were hesitant to join the Imperium. Although they initially wanted to, their fear that the Imperium of mankind might be tainted by the forces of chaos slowed down diplomacy. Meanwhile, Erebus secretly infiltrated the Interrex Museum of Technology and stole a powerful alien artifact called the Anathema. This ancient sword was imbued with the power of a curse to mortally wound any chosen individual, harming it beyond any hope of recovery. The theft of the weapon seemed to confirm the Interrex's earlier suspicions that the Imperium could not be trusted. They blamed the War Master for the missing weapon and declared war upon the Imperium. The accusation towards the War Master was a grave insult. The Astartes forgot the mega-arachnids on planet Murder and instead focused their complete attention towards fighting the Interrex. After a lengthy, strenuous battle, they eventually managed to wipe out the Interrex civilization completely. After the War of Extermination on Zenobia, Sanguinius convinced Horus to finally rename the Lunar Wolves Legion as the Emperor had initially suggested. Directly encouraged by his brother, this time Horus agreed. And so the 16th Legion became known as the Sons of Horus. They changed the color of their armor from white to green. Their symbol of a moon-crested wolf was discarded, and they adopted the Eye of Terror, symbolizing the Emperor's eternal vigilance. Although the Legion's change of name in the honor of the War Master was a celebrated event, the war with the Interrex had been a bitter affair. Despite the bloody conflict, the civilization had been a model society of advanced human technology, and the War Master lamented having to destroy such a world over such a foolish misunderstanding. But he wouldn't have time to contemplate the recent events. They received a request for support from the world of Davin. Davin had been one of the first worlds the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet had conquered. The Sons of Horus, back then the Lunar Wolves, still harbored proud memories of fighting and defeating the Davinite warriors. After their initial victory, Horus had assigned the task of bringing the world to further Imperial compliance to his trusted friend and Imperial Army Commander Eugene Temba, assisted by a small detachment of the Wordbearers Legion. However, the Imperial Army elements led by Eugene Temba had renounced their loyalty to the Imperium and established a rebel base on the moon of Davin. Chaplain Erebus had already returned to Davin to deal with the uprising, but found the rebels were too numerous for his small contingent of wordbearers to deal with, and so he had requested support. It was the first large-scale rebellion by Imperial forces that had taken place since the start of the Great Crusade, and a considerable blemish on the War Master's otherwise impeccable records. Since the 16th Legion had initially conquered Davin, Erebus offered Horus the opportunity to personally avenge the betrayal and bring it into compliance himself. Enraged by the disloyalty of his friend Eugene, the War Master ordered the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet to make haste towards Davin. The War Master and his council planned a large-scale offensive to destroy the rebel base on Davin's moon, but they soon learned that the surface and atmosphere of the moon had changed considerably from when they first conquered it so long ago. What had once been a dry and desert-like terrain had mysteriously transformed into a planet-wide humid swamp. They had no explanation for what happened to the moon, but this would not stop their assault. However, it did prohibit their heavy tanks from deploying to the surface. But fortunately, the Titans of Legio Mortis, the Titan Legion that accompanied the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, would have no problems traversing through the swamps. A massive force of 400 Space Marines, 4,000 Imperial Army units, and 3 Titans prepared to make planetfall. The Space Marines of the Sons of Horus would lead the way. But during the descent, the Astartes Stormbirds picked up an audio signal from the surface. A faint, demonic-sounding voice was speaking over the Vox network.
The ways of man, folly, seek doom of all things. In death and rebirth shall mankind live forever.
To Garviel Loken's horror, the voice had an eerie similarity to the voice of Samus he heard during the Battle of the Whisperhead Mountains, the very same voice that had corrupted battle brother Xavier Jubal on 63-19. He warned the War Master, but Horus had no intentions of turning back now. Just like before, the voice was simply disregarded as enemy propaganda or a cowardly scare tactic. But the origin of the audio signal was traced, and they adjusted course to where they suspected it was coming from, for that is where the enemy was most likely to be located. It led them to an old Imperial battleship by the name of Emperor's Glory. The traitors had crash-landed it on the planet, and it now served as the rebel base. The Astartes disembarked from their Stormbirds into knee-deep swampy water. The foes they encountered were indeed the rebel Imperial Army forces under leadership of the traitorous governor Eugene Temba. But just like the planet, they had changed. Their soldiers had turned into zombie-like corpses, their formal Imperial Army uniforms raggedly hanging from their decaying bodies. They attacked the Sons of Horus in large, mindless waves. Arms came up from the murky waters and dragged many Space Marines down into the swamps, drowning many of them. Despite the attackers' ghastly, lifeless appearance, they possessed a brute force, and it took the Astartes all of their discipline to fight off the attacks. Horus personally led the spear tip of the Astartes force into the downed starship. But as they battled their way deep into the belly of the ship, the Emperor's Glory started to tilt. Enormous waves of swamp water splashed out of the way as the wreckage of the large ship rolled over. Those on the outside, close enough to the ship, were swallowed by the mud or crushed underneath the hull of the ship. Inside, Horus and 200 of his Astartes were tumbled upside down. Rusted steel deck layers gave way to the weight of the ship and collapsed, crushing many Space Marines to death despite their protective power armor. Due to his near-indestructible suit of power armor, Horus survived the incident. But nonetheless, one of his lungs was punctured by a steel rod. He pulled it out, and his enhanced physiology almost instantly sealed the wound. But he found himself alone, with no response to his Vox signals, despite hearing many groans and shouts of wounded Space Marines echo throughout the remnants of the ship. He had no hope of finding them in the confusing wreckage. He pushed on and soon arrived on what looked like the command bridge of the ship. The warp was strong here, and his vision was troubled by hallucinations of decay. He felt disturbed. Not even when fighting the menacing war boss back on Ulanor had he felt such a thing. For the first time in his life, Horus was afraid. He was confronted by a walking, bloated, rotten corpse wearing the remnants of an old Imperial uniform that belonged to Eugene Temba. Horus realized his old friend was possessed by the powers of the warp. Unbeknownst to the War Master, the demon that controlled Eugene's corpse also carried a special sword, the Anathema. The very Xenos weapon Erebus had stolen from the Interrex Museum of Technology on Zenobia. With clashing swords, they dueled inside of the ship's wreckage. Although the rotten body moved with surprising speed, the demon ultimately proved no match for the mighty Primarch. Horus wanted to bring an end to the horrors swiftly, and so committed to a murderous but reckless stroke. As he struck down his foe, the stolen anathema blade pierced his arm. The demon lost control of the Xenos sword, and both fell down to the ground. Without the blade, the demon was defeated, and it departed from the decaying body. Relieved of the demonic possession, for a moment the real Eugene Temba came back to himself. His mortally wounded body still bloated and rotten, but alive. With his last breath, he asked Horus for forgiveness, and then died right there in the Primarch's arms. In the lowly bowels of the wrecked ship, Horus was overcome by emotion and wept for his lost friend. Outside of the ship, the Legio Mortis had arrived. The Titans did what they could to stop the hordes, but their bulky weapons had been of little assistance to the struggling Space Marines fighting in hand-to-hand combat in the swamps below. Dozens of Astartes had already died. But as soon as Horus had defeated the demon, the attacking suddenly stopped. Their bodies collapsed and simply became unmoving corpses. The warp possession on Davin had lifted, and the moon started to recover back to its former desert biosphere. The members of the Mournival searched the wreckage and found the War Master still bleeding and in shock on the command bridge. They escorted him outside, but to their surprise he collapsed to the ground and fell unconscious. With great speed they carried his body to a Stormbird and rushed back to the Medicae station on Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. But upon the return of the Stormbirds, a crowd of remembrances flocked to the embarkation deck to catch the first news of the anticipated victory over the rebels. But Horus was in a critical condition, and the Mournival was in no mood to slow down for the crowd of people that were now blocking their way. They violently clubbed and pushed themselves apart through the assembled mob, killing more than a dozen remembrances and crew members on their way to the Medicae. But unfortunately their haste would not be rewarded. No matter what the Legion's apothecaries tried, they could not heal his wound. The mysterious mortal wound caused by the anathema was beyond their knowledge. The cut in his arm would not stop bleeding, and if nothing was done, the War Master would eventually bleed out and die. Garvio Loken, Terek Torgeddon, and Nero Vipus rushed back to the surface in search of the weapon that had caused the wound in hopes that it would help them find a cure. They found the anathema in the wreckage next to the rotting corpse of Eugene Temba where Horus had slain him. Garvio recognized the blade. He had seen it in the Interrex Museum on Zenobia before it was stolen. Only one person could have brought it to Davin before the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet had arrived. Erebus, but why? What would anyone have to gain from killing the War Master? Who else was behind this plot? Whatever the answer to these questions might be, it was already too late. The other two members of the Mournival, Abaddon and Axamond, had remained on the Vengeful Spirit, while Horus was slowly dying. They had been summoned to an emergency warrior lodge meeting by Erebus. The word-bearer's chaplain informed them of a place where the War Master might be healed. A shrine on the moon of Davin called the Serpent's Temple. It was clear the Legion's apothecaries would not be able to save him, and so the arcane healing methods of the Davin shaman was their last hope. Desperate for anything that could keep their beloved Primarch alive, they followed Erebus's advice. They had put the unconscious body of Horus in a stasis field to prolong his life, and quickly brought him to the temple on the moon's surface. When the others finally arrived at the temple, the gates had already been locked and sealed. Abaddon, Axamond, and several other sons of Horus stood guard outside, but Chaplain Erebus was nowhere to be found. The Astartes blocked the way in to prevent anyone from interrupting the healing ceremony that had already begun. All of them had their bolters ready and loaded in case of conflict. Loken was reluctant to fight his own sworn brothers, and was ultimately forced to yield to their questionable decision. Obviously, the reliance on some mysterious shamanistic ritual was a complete abandonment of the secular imperial truth as it had been commanded by the Emperor. But the Emperor wasn't here. He had left the Great Crusade and ordered his favorite son, Horus Lupercal, to pick up the pieces. The forces of the Warp, whatever they may be, had conspired against him and prevailed. But the sons of Horus, and the members of the Mournival specifically, could not bear the loss of their Gene Father. He was on the brink of death, and they had to make a decision. And so, despite everything the Imperium stood for, in a desperate move, the fate of Horus was put in the hands of these witch doctors. After 8 days, the gates would open again, and the sons of Horus would find out if the War Master would live or perish.